So what I'll do is I'll just go over today's agenda and introduce our speakers for today's session. So after I've just given a brief introduction, I'll hand over to my colleague Les Adobe, who's head of our counter-fraud training. So Les will just will give a kind of a background and context to the UK fraud landscape, and then also our a background to our counter-fraud training on and the journey so far. And then our colleague Heidi, who looks after as our counter-fraud apprenticeship manager, will talk about the counter-fraud investigator apprenticeship program in more detail. And then we'll have some time for some questions and answers at the end. And so please feel free to put any questions you have into the chat box. So without further ado, I'll hand over now to my colleague Les.
Hello, thank you, David. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Thank you for the introduction. Hello, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Just turned 12 o'clock. Yes, I'm Les Doby, and I head up the counter-fraud training facility department at CIPFA, and I've done it for it's coming up to 6 years now. I think 6 years this month that I've been involved in CIPFA. I've been asked to come along today to talk about the apprenticeship, although Heidi, my colleague and apprenticeship manager, will be talking more about it than I will be. I've just been asked to come along primarily to give some context and background. And the first thing I want to talk about is the fraud landscape. You'll see a slide up there from Lord Agnew, who tells us how bad the fraud situation is in the UK. Yeah, who knew, as I would say. It is bad and it's increasing, and like much else in this country, COVID has brought into relief the potential size of the problem. But that's today. To give context to maybe how we got here and how far this problem goes back, we'll give a very broad sweep and a canter through the landscape. Now, I was talking to Heidi, my colleague, yesterday, and said, well, how far do we go back? For me, one of the oldest cases that I'm aware of goes back to the 14th century in 1307, when the vicar of Dodford in the Bromsgrove in the West Midlands was accused of fraud. He sold a horse to someone who he claimed wasn't lame, and it was, and that was the recorded first action of fraud in this country. But Heidi said we're probably going a bit too far back to the 14th century. And so maybe we want to bring it forward because we run out of time by the time we get to the 17th century. So that's fair enough. So what I want to do is reflect on when I came into the counter-fraud landscape, which was the early to mid 1980s when I was working in London. It was a different time, of course, and certainly fraud was something that was treated completely differently to what it is now. It did exist, but in terms of in the public's consciousness, it didn't feature that much at all. I remember as a young police officer in the Metropolitan Police at that point, fraud, well, there wasn't an offence of fraud because it was not a statutory offence. It was dealt with under the Theft Act in England and Wales. Paradoxically, when people did make allegations of what was deception, it was recorded in the major crime book, but was never dealt with as a major crime and was dealt with as something akin to shoplifting or straightforward theft. And so it wasn't treated that seriously at all. The British Crime Survey was set up in 1982, and of course, fraud didn't feature because it wasn't an offence as such. Deception offences didn't feature. But what the survey said in 1984, which is when I started, was that the most ubiquitous crime, acquisitive crime that the public were concerned about during that period was not burglary, it was not robbery, it was not theft of car, it was people stealing milk bottles off doorsteps. That's what concerned the British public all those years ago. Fraud just did not feature. So we fast forward to June last year, where the English Crime Survey, which is the latest iteration of the British Crime Survey, because Scotland has its own arrangements, that states last year that fraud is now the most ubiquitous crime in the UK. Not just the most ubiquitous acquisitive crime, it is the most ubiquitous crime, and is causing severe harm and concern to the public. 4.3 million allegations of fraud last year. in England and Wales. 4% year-on-year increase. So the problem is undoubtedly getting worse, and as I said, COVID has magnified and amplified and exacerbated that. So it's now a severe problem. It is now in the public consciousness, and so when it comes to crime and harms that crime causes, the public quite rightly looks towards the government and towards law enforcement for a solution, because one of the first duties of a government is to protect its citizens from harm. And so where do we stand on that? What has the authorities' response been? Well, it's a mixed bag. What studies have shown is that probably 0.5% of the police force in England and Wales is dedicated to fraud. That works out at about 650 officers to deal with essentially 4.3 million crimes. The Commissioner of the City of London Police, which is the designated police force by the government to deal with fraud in this country, says we can't arrest our way out of this. We can't investigate our way out of this. And so therefore the message is those organisations and individuals that suffer from fraud have to employ a large degree of self-help because there's just not enough resource within law enforcement. Despite all the agencies that deal with it, the NCA, the police, the Serious Fraud Office, there's still not enough resource to get on top of this. So the message is largely self-help. But towards over this, I guess, when it comes to fraud. In 2006, the government set up the Fraud Review, which some of you who've been around for a while may remember. The Fraud Review was intended to shine a light on the problem of fraud in the UK, and its overarching aim was to create anti-fraud culture within the public and other institutions to make the UK a hostile environment. There's a phrase, a hostile environment for fraudsters. That brought about the Fraud Act in England and Wales in 2007. So for the first time, we had a statutory offence of fraud. Hot on the heels was the National Fraud Authority in 2008, which was then closed down in 2014 with no palpable or tangible arrangements in place to replace it. And that was it really. We still have institutions in this country dealing with fraud. It's a mixed bag, a patchwork of organisations. There doesn't seem to be any joined up strategy, but the message continues to be self-help. You must try and do something about these yourselves and not rely upon the government or law enforcement for too much assistance. So that, of course, leads us to the skills agenda. And what that means. So if the message is people must help themselves, then surely they must have those skills and knowledge in order to do that, which brings us to the counter-fraud training slide, the journey so far, as I see it. And the journey really follows the trajectory of what I've just explained in terms of how the landscape has developed over the years, in that a good while ago there was nothing. Counter-fraud activity was not really seen as an established profession, certainly, or even an established discipline. But things have changed. I think the Fraud Review, despite some of its shortcomings, did shine a light on the problem. And round about the turn of this century, there was the emergence of what is the Counter-Fraud Professional Accreditation Board, which is an amalgamation of the NHS Accreditation Board and the DWP Accreditation Board, both organisations having within them and developed a capability to counter fraud, realising that this is an issue they could not rely upon law enforcement to solve for them. And so the CIPFA was formed, and since then it's probably issued about 25,000 accreditations in professional counter fraud training across the UK, and it's still going strong today, I may add. In 1993, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners established a UK chapter. This is an American outfit, which people will no doubt be familiar with who work in the counter-fraud sector, but largely focused upon the commercial sector because in the early days, the CIPFA was not accessible to private sector organisations, which is not the case now, but there's certainly a legacy of that. And that was it really from 1993 in the establishment of the CIPFA until fairly recently. And I recall 7 years ago or so when I was working in professional practice, going up to the Cabinet Office in Whitehall to meet a guy who I'd never met before, called Mark Cheeseman, who had a couple of colleagues with him. And Mark sat me down and was interested, for reasons that I'm not quite clear, to gather my thoughts on what needed to be done in the counter fraud sector, because they were thinking about developing standards for counter fraud within government, and then moving towards professionalisation, which of course is music to my ears, because it's something that I've certainly been keen on throughout the whole of my career, which spans back over 4 decades now. And from that was developed the government counter fraud profession, which came along about 2 years ago. And on the back of that profession, we now have what we're here to talk about today, is the Counter Fraud Investigator Apprenticeship as the ground level, the foundation stone, if you like, for counter fraud learning and development professionalisation in this country. So we have come a long way over the period that I've spoken about. But what does the future hold? Because certainly, is to quote Winston Churchill, this is not the beginning of the end. It's more like the end of the beginning in terms of counter fraud professionalism and development, in that these apprenticeships that are coming through, or these apprentices, they will look to develop their careers within this sector, and therefore we're looking for future leaders. Future leaders will need more training, more development, more skills other than technical skills, leadership skills, management skills, and high-level qualifications to bring them to some kind of parity with lawyers and accountants and other professions. Because I think the past has been sold now that counter fraud is a profession, and therefore we need to have that educational framework in to establish and create and develop the leaders for the future. So for me, this is really exciting, because the apprenticeship is the foundation for all of that. So I look forward to the next half hour or so, 40 minutes, to discuss this. So over to you, Heidi.
Many thanks, Les. So very briefly, just following on from Les and the development of the profession, I came up through the profession in the old system of developing counter fraud staff. So I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with this, where you kind of just learnt what you could on the job from your colleagues. So I'm extremely passionate about the newly approved apprenticeship standard, and of course the opportunities that this will bring to really nurture up and coming counter fraud practitioners and develop the profession as a whole. So without further ado, let's take a look at why you should choose an apprenticeship as a means of developing your staff, or indeed yourself, and of course strengthening the counter fraud response within your organisation. So apprenticeships are a really cost-effective way of developing people, regardless of whether they're school leavers, graduates, or professionals who are looking for a change of career direction. As there's significant funding available from the government to cover the cost of the training. So we will talk about the apprenticeship levy and available funding shortly. But I think one of the myths about apprenticeships is that people think that they're only suitable for school leavers, and this certainly isn't the case. So while they can be used to hire someone completely new to the profession, they can also be used to upskill an existing employee. So, for example, employers might have staff working in intelligence, support, compliance, or maybe admin roles who are keen to develop themselves in counter fraud, or who the employer deems would be a suitable candidate for the programme. This versatility makes it a really exciting and attractive prospect for employers who don't necessarily have the means or the budget to hire in new staff, but recognise that they have staff within their existing teams who would benefit from a fully supported and structured development programme. In terms of hiring and supporting new apprentices, this of course can be quite a daunting prospect for some employers who've never been through this process. But at CIPFA, we're always on hand to support our employers, so please don't hesitate to get in touch with myself if you'd like to discuss the recruitment of your apprentices, or indeed the suitability of existing staff. Okay, so moving on to the benefits of the apprenticeship. Apologies. Okay. So you may have seen in the media recently that the Royal United Services Institute reported that the fraud epidemic is a threat to our national security. Excuse me. Levels of fraudulent activity are drastically increasing, as Les mentioned earlier, and post-pandemic, this is even more prevalent. And so there really is only one way to combat this. We have to expand and upskill our workforce. We have to invest in our time and commitment into growing talent and giving our staff the knowledge and the skills which they need to identify, prevent, deter fraud. And of course, to actively and successfully pursue those who commit fraud against the public purse. So this means developing a motivated, skilled and professionally competent workforce, thus strengthening the counter-fraud response within our organisations. In addition to all of this, one of the key features of the CIPFA apprenticeship is that we place specific focus on the intricacies of your organisation. And the programme is structured in such a way that the apprentice is required to examine these intricacies. So they are examining your internal policies, your internal procedures as part of their training programme. And so CIPFA apprentices are not only fully prepared for the wider scheme of investigating, but they also understand how all of their training fits into their day-to-day role and into the practical application of their duties. Another added benefit, Les also mentioned this, is that the apprenticeship is a means of direct entry into the government counter-fraud profession. And this opens up a world of opportunities for our apprentices who wish to pursue a career in the GCFP. This is an academically vigorous and challenging programme, and it does require a significant amount of employer engagement. That being said, the time spent developing the apprentice in the workplace really is the only commitment for the employer because, as I mentioned earlier, the costs of the training are covered. So that leads me nicely onto the apprenticeship levy and how you can fund this programme. This apprenticeship's got a maximum funding band of £15,000, and this covers the cost of all of the formal tuition, so that's over 210 hours of classroom time, all of the revision, additional support, and of course all of the programme materials. It also includes all of our work-based learning coach support, quarterly progress reviews, the apprentice's e-portfolio, and the endpoint assessment fees, which are inclusive of one free resit. One key thing to mention here is that the government has introduced payments or incentives to support employers who are hiring new apprentices up until the 31st of March. And it has just announced that if you take on a new apprentice from the 1st of February up until the 31st of March, you can still claim these incentives up until the 30th of April. So for apprentices aged 16 to 24, the additional incentive is £2,000, and for apprentices aged 25 and over, employers will receive an additional £1,500. There are a document that we will share with you at the end of the presentation so that you can look into those incentives if you'd like to explore that more. Okay, so organisations who don't pay into the apprenticeship levy can still access this apprenticeship. In these cases, the employer is required to pay just 5% towards the cost of the training, and the government will top this up to the maximum funding band of £15,000. And so the apprenticeship really is accessible to any organisation that has a counter-fraud function. There are some additional costs which fall outside of the apprenticeship levy. So these are things like the apprentice's salary plus the on-costs. Obviously, if you've got an existing employee, you are already paying that salary. Also, the assessment and accreditation fees for the Accredited Counter-Fraud Specialist Award, or ACFS, can't be funded from the levy, and the total charge for this is £200. There is also an optional membership fee to our new association, which we'll talk about in a little while, and that is £50, which covers the whole 2-year apprenticeship. As you can see, the costs are reasonable, and like I said, they are optional. Okay, so let's have a look at the very well regarded Accredited Counter-Fraud Specialist Award. Our CIPFA apprentices have the unique opportunity to study the ACFS Professional Award in addition to their apprenticeship. The ACFS is externally accredited by the CFPAB, who Les mentioned earlier, and they are still the benchmark for counter-fraud training in the UK. CFP members include DWP, HMRC, City of London Police, CIPFA and of course CIPFA. It has a formally accredited syllabus which is set by the CFPAB and carries with it 40 academic credits. Also, all of CIPFA's counter-fraud trainers are accredited by the CFPAB, and this is a guaranteed feature of our programme, one that you are unlikely to find elsewhere in the sector. The ACFS and CFPAB accredited trainers are a mark of excellence, and so you can be completely confident that at CIPFA we will develop counter-fraud professionals of the highest calibre and the best in class. Okay, so just a very brief overview of our new association. We are really passionate about involvement in wider counter-fraud activities and professional networking. And so CIPFA apprentices have the opportunity to join our brand new Association of Counter-Fraud Practitioners, or ACFP. The ACFP is a nascent global community for counter-fraud and anti-corruption practitioners, and something that we are developing at the moment. And using our status as an international professional institute headquartered in the UK, CIPFA will bring together its global alumni to be the premier membership organisation for public sector counter-fraud and anti-corruption practitioners. Our vision is to give ACFP members access to experienced industry professionals, priority registration to webinars, access to counter-fraud news, industry updates, outstanding CPD opportunities, and of course discounted rates on CIPFA's counter-fraud courses and events. Again, this is optional, it's not a mandatory part of the programme. However, we strongly encourage our apprentices to take advantage of this opportunity. Okay, so moving on then to the entry requirements. Essentially, the only entry requirement for this programme is that apprentices must have significant distance to travel in terms of reaching the required standard of professional competence. Excuse me. What this means in practice is that the apprenticeship is not suitable for an employee who already has significant experience in the field of investigating. However, prior knowledge, learning and professional experience will not necessarily preclude someone from the programme. All of prospective apprentices are initially assessed to determine their level of competence, and where there is the requisite distance to travel, they will be suitable to come on programme. Apprentices are tested for functional skills, so that's English and maths at level 1 as part of the initial assessment. The apprentices also have to have English and maths at level 2 by the time they reach their endpoint assessment, but they can achieve this whilst on programme. So moving on then to the actual programme and what it involves. The apprenticeship takes 2 years to complete, and it comprises of a fully supported formal tuition programme. Apprentices are assessed throughout the course of the programme and then again at the end by way of an endpoint assessment. So the formal tuition, there's 14 modules in total. These are studied in the first 21 months of the programme, and the remaining 3 months is the endpoint assessment period. The programme is complemented by carefully designed and very well structured learning and work-based activities, and these promote the desired knowledge, skills and behaviours as set out in the apprenticeship standard. On average, apprentices are required to attend 2 to 3 formal tuition days per month, although this can vary on some modules. So for an apprentice who works a 36-hour week, they would be required to spend an average of about 31 months completing their apprenticeship, 31 hours per month completing their apprenticeship training. And so it's really important that employers and prospective apprentices are committed to this, and that employers understand that they will need to release their staff for this time. Okay, so this is just a very brief snapshot of some of the knowledge elements of the apprenticeship. And while we can't possibly cover all of the knowledge that our apprentices will gain on programme in just one slide, these are some of those to give you an idea of the breadth and depth of our programme. We will also be developing a range of vital skills, so let's have a quick look at those. Okay, so the skills and behaviours that you see here range from the adoption of the investigative mindset to collaborative working. Essentially, these are many of the skills you'd like to see in a future counter-fraud professional. So if that's the vision that you have for yourself or for the employers here today, the vision that you have for the candidates you are considering, then CIPFA's apprenticeship programme should be a perfect fit. We will work really closely with our apprentices to develop and nurture these skills, and as a team of experienced and knowledgeable counter-fraud professionals, we are perfectly placed to do so. Okay, so moving on to the assessments. As I said, throughout the course of the apprenticeship, apprentices undertake a series of informal assessments, and these complement the process and allow us and them to track their progression. Apprentices who elect to study the additional ACFS element are required to sit 8 formal assessments over the course of the programme. The endpoint assessment, or the EPA, is the final assessment of the apprenticeship. Essentially, it's an objective and impartial assessment of all of the knowledge, skills and behaviours which are set out in the standard. So just to give you a very brief overview of what this looks like in practice, the endpoint assessment has 2 components. The first, it takes the form of a professional discussion, and this is underpinned by an evidence portfolio. And the second is a presentation, an investigation report, and a series of questions based on an ongoing counter-fraud investigation. Of course, there is lots of technique and skills required to successfully pass the endpoint assessment. And so the tuition that we provide at CIPFA will fully prepare our apprentices for this and ensure that they feel confident in their abilities as a professionally competent investigator, and they'll be more than ready to successfully complete the EPA. So moving swiftly on, I'm aware that I'm far too talkative and conscious of time. So why should you choose CIPFA? Well, I'm sure that many of you are here because you already know that CIPFA offers an outstanding learning experience and that we work tirelessly to improve best practice and performance in the public sector. You may also be aware that we're a proven online training provider, and I'm very, very proud to say an internationally recognised centre of excellence. Of course, we've already talked about the ACFS, and currently CIPFA is the only training provider who is able to offer this. All of these are excellent reasons to choose CIPFA as your training provider, but we like to go way and above and beyond the call of duty. And so in addition to all of this, we offer the highest levels of support and guidance to all of our apprentices and of course our employers. We will regularly assess the growing competence of our learners, and we will provide one-to-one support wherever this is needed to ensure that our apprentices succeed on their programme. This is a carefully structured and fully supported programme which will develop knowledgeable, skilled and confident counter-fraud professionals who will, without a doubt, add value to their organisations. So I guess the question I expect you're all asking yourselves is, how do I immediately register for this exciting and innovative programme? Well, all you need to do is email us and we will support you through the rest of the process. The apprenticeship is on the slides. These will be circulated. So thank you very much for your time today. It really has been a pleasure. I hope that it has been informative, and I will hand back over to David, as I'm sure some of you have some questions.
Okay, thanks Heidi, and thanks Les as well. Okay, so we have allowed plenty of time for questions, so you can either just kind of unmute yourself or put your hand up electronically, or just put your question in the chat box, and we'll attempt to get through as many questions as possible. Just while we're just waiting for a few questions to come through, I thought it was also just worth pointing out that although the counter-fraud apprenticeship is a new apprenticeship for CIPFA to be delivering, CIPFA have been delivering training, as Les pointed out, both accountancy training and counter-fraud training for many years. In terms of apprenticeships, CIPFA has been delivering apprenticeships since 2017. So we are experienced in delivering apprenticeships. We're a fully approved apprenticeship training provider. And we currently have 600 learners on our various apprenticeship programs. So we do have a fair amount of experience. So yes, let's just get down to some questions. So Diane has asked, will there be a later program? Heidi, question for you.
Yes, there certainly will. So our first cohort begins in April, and we will be running a second cohort to begin in October 2021. So if you don't, if you can't register for the April cohort, there's certainly another opportunity later on in the year.
Okay, thanks, Heidi. I think, Christos, that answers your question about how many intakes. So we're planning, first of all, to be 2 intakes in this year, and then we'll see how demand goes. Marie, your question about how many apprentices does CIPFA provide for counter fraud? Obviously, this is a new programme, so we'll be starting that off in April, but obviously there will only be a limited number of places available. So Stephen's asked about, is there funding for the apprenticeship in Wales? Stephen, the short answer is no, not at the moment. So the way the apprenticeship funding works is that, so all employers, including public sector employers, with a pay bill, a wage bill of over 3 million, pay into the apprenticeship levy. So that will include employers in Wales. But the system, the education system is different because it's education is devolved. So in Wales, it would have to be a training provider in Wales, and it works slightly differently. So once we've got the programme up and running, then we will look to explore whether we can deliver the apprenticeship in the devolved nations. You can, however, still enrol and pay commercially for CIPFA's counter fraud qualification, but just not part of your levy, or not using levy funding for it, I'm afraid. Okay, so question from Jennifer from GIA. Does the job vacancy have to specifically reference that the role is an apprenticeship? So I'll answer that, and then Heidi, you can chip in with anything else. So I think you don't have to describe the role as them being an apprentice, but if the role requires them to do any study, so it's a part of the job role, then you would need to mention that, or it would be sensible to mention it in your job or in your recruitment, your job advert, that actually it will include study for an apprenticeship, which actually will attract candidates. Heidi, anything else you wanted to add on that particular topic?
No, nothing to add. I know that apprenticeship, so vacancies that do include job vacancies that include apprenticeships within them do need to be listed on a government. There is a place on the .gov website where you can list all of your vacancies.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was all. Nothing else to add apart from that.
Thanks, Heidi. Yeah, so that's just about so that all apprenticeship vacancies are also advertised on the .gov vacancy website for apprentices. Okay, so Alex, if I'm already an accredited counter fraud technician, does this give me exemptions to progress towards the ACFS qualification as part of the programme? Or Les, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Thank you, David. Yes, Alex. So what happens is, like I said, the ACF Tech is, a much a smaller version of the ACFS. So if somebody had the ACFS, we would say they wouldn't need to come onto the apprenticeship programme. With the ACF Tech, what we would do is you would go through the initial assessment, and then we would look at all of the areas where perhaps you didn't need to study that particular lesson or that particular module. And then we would make an assessment and we would reduce your levy funding accordingly. So the amount that we claim from the levy, because we would say, okay, Alex doesn't really need these 3 modules because he's already got them on ACF Tech. So we will reduce the amount we claim from the levy to account for the fact that you don't need that training, but it won't preclude you from the programme. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Heidi. John has asked, how many are we looking to have on our first cohort? I think the numbers, we are going to limit the numbers to a maximum somewhere between 20 and 40. Heidi, is that about right?
Actually, it is going to be 20 for the first intake. So we want to keep the numbers quite small. Actually, we're aiming for the first cohort to be, you know, a smaller group, so that we can, you know, for the first round, make sure that everything is running perfectly. But yes, there will be 2 intakes of 20 in April and another intake of 20 in the October.
Thanks, Heidi. Great. So Diane's just asked, will there be any sample job descriptions?
That's a really good question. I do not have a sample job description, but I am aware of one of my employers that has signed up to the programme, who has recently just recruited a brand new apprentice for the purposes of this apprenticeship. So I'm sure that he would be happy to share that with me, and, you know, a generic version, and, you know, we'd be happy to share that with you as a guideline, if you like. It's not a problem. If you could drop me an email or just drop a note in the chat box, and I'll make sure that I get that out to you after the meeting.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Diane. Okay, so I think I've covered the initial questions people have. So just to reiterate what Heidi was saying, if you are interested in either signing up for the programme yourself, or that you have colleagues, or you're looking to recruit apprentices, do just drop us an email on our email address. Heidi, did you just want to go back a slide just to show what the email address was? Because I've forgotten.
There we go.
Yeah, so again, if you're either have any further questions about the programme, or you are interested in enrolling a colleague or for yourself, do drop us an email to register your interest at CFI-apprenticeships@cipfa.org. So John's just asked, will we be, are we the EPA for the programme, or is that going to be done by another organisation?
Yes, so the endpoint assessment is externally accredited. There are currently 2 endpoint assessment organisations who assess for the counter fraud standard, as it is very new. So yes, it is external to CIPFA. And we can provide you with all of the information about, you know, the endpoint assessment plan, everything that it entails. There's a fully comprehensive guide available from the Institute of Apprenticeships and Technical Education. So if anybody does want that information that's particular to the standard and all of the endpoint assessment guidance, we can provide that also. Just give us a shout.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, so CIPFA will be the training provider for the Counter Fraud Apprenticeship Standard, and we'll be using a separate approved EPA awarding body for the actual endpoint assessment. Okay, so I think what we'll do is we'll just hang on for just a couple more minutes if anyone's got any more questions. What we will do is we will circulate a copy of the slides for today's webinar, together with a recording to everyone that has attended. And obviously that will include our contact details again if you're interested in the programme, or if you have any more questions about the programme. So I think we might be giving you 15 minutes back, which is excellent. We do try to make our webinars to finish promptly within the hour, but I think we've overachieved, Heidi. So excellent.
Yeah, I just wanted everybody to, you know, have a chance to grab a coffee and a croissant or whatever before their next meeting. So thanks everybody. It's been lovely.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Heidi. Thank you, Les. And thanks very much for everyone for attending. And at this point, I'll close the meeting. We will hang on if anyone else has got any other questions, but otherwise we'll close the meeting now. Thank you very much.